Okay, what we just watched was the ends of American getting involved in World War II. We saw elements of D-Day. We saw how we created this coalition between these three conflicts to create one war. Prior to the war being over, the election of 1944 will take place, and FDR will be elected to an unprecedented fourth term as president. Okay, what we're going to start talking about basically is getting into the Truman administration. Okay, because in that first year, April of 1945, FDR is going to die from a massive stroke. The war won't quite be over. FDR won't see the war in Europe over. It'll be Truman, and in Truman's speech about Victory in Europe Day, Truman will comment about the fact that he only wished that FDR could have seen the day where actual victory in Europe could have been accomplished. What basically we need to discuss is the creation of what's usually most texts refer to as the institutionalized Cold War. Again, I've always said that the Cold War for the United States starts well before 1945, 1949. Here, make sure I get the book in frame. I think the Cold War starts in 1917. This is a good book if you want to reference this. It's a really nice book called The Specter of Communism, the United States and the Origins of the Cold War, 1917 to 1953. This lays out the argument that the Cold War was something that happens basically at the end of World War I, is when the United States starts having animosity against what will become the Soviet Union. But it's in Truman's administration that this doctrine, this sort of ideology, becomes institutionalized. It becomes our national precedent. This is the way we always deal with the communists, and especially with the Soviet Union. Okay, and so we're going to look at this from that perspective. And if it can be said that FDR had created what some critics will call the welfare state, when Truman takes command, when Truman takes charge of the country, Truman is going to preside over the creation of the national security state, and it's going to change the way that not only we view ourselves, but the way we view our foreign policy in the world. Now, this photograph is one of the last times that the big three, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, are going to meet together. You can see that FDR is, he looks frazzled. This is, I guess this is the conference at, I guess it's the Crimean Conference, Potsdam. This is in February, 1945. In February 1945. We're pretty sure D-Day has been successful, and these guys are meeting together. Okay. Now they're talking about the strategy. How are we going to combine all three forces in an effort to crush the Germans? This conference is where Churchill, Truman, and Stalin all meet together, and this is after victory in Europe, except we have, as of yet, not completely destroyed Japan. We're still fighting in the Pacific. The war in Europe has been completed. Now, Stalin at this conference approaches Truman and says, you know, FDR promised that if we would help him with the Japanese problem, as you remember from back in a few episodes earlier, that he would give us all of your retired battleships and destroyers. Stalin says, I would like to, take advantage of that agreement. Truman says, I know nothing about that agreement. That must have been an agreement you had with FDR. I don't believe we're going to need your assistance. We've developed a new weapon. And this new weapon, we believe, will bring a swift end to the war in the Pacific. Now, many people believe that what Truman is doing is issuing a veiled threat to Stalin. And in just a few weeks, the United States is going to drop the first bomb on the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Now, interestingly enough, it's at this conference that even in the even in the text, George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, it lays out the fact that at this conference, Truman mentions the impending publication of a brand new book, and he recommends it to Joseph Stalin, called Animal Farm. Those of you who've read Animal Farm, you know where he's coming from with this. Truman is an anti-communist. Truman does not like the communists, and for Truman, FDR was a little bit too diplomatic with regard to communism, and Truman will have none of it. Now, little did Truman know, FDR already knew, or Stalin already knew about the bomb that was being tested, because we know for a fact that Stalin had spies in Los Alamos, in the testing grounds where they tested the first atomic blast. The Rosenbergs are their names, and you'll read about them in this chapter. What's going to happen in Eisenhower, or in Truman's presidency, is Truman is going to create what's referred to as the national security state. Okay, he's going to change the way that the government does business, as far as the military, as far as government, as far as intelligence, and things are going to change. Okay, he's got planned a 5-pronged defense strategy as he's moving forward as president. First, we're going to develop more atomic weapons, because at the end of World War I, this proves to be a very effective means of bringing this war to a close. We are going to strengthen our traditional military powers, and we are going to create military alliances with other countries. Again, in complete contradiction to what George Washington had told the country in his early days. We will offer military economic aid to friendly countries, and by friendly countries, we mean countries opposed to communism. Countries opposed to communism. And we are going to strengthen our espionage network, and secretly try to subvert the commies as we move forward. So what's going to be created in the Congress is the National Security Act of 1947. Okay, it creates a new Department of Defense. We never had a Department of Defense before. We had a Department of War. So the philosophy is, when do you need a Department of War? You need a Department of War when you're at war. But when do you need a Department of Defense? You should always be on the defense. You should always be on the defense. So now the Department of Defense will have ongoing missions other than just training for war. Okay? We will increase our nuclear buildup. We will start building more and more of these atomic bombs. Truman is going to create an agency within the executive branch called the NSC, the National Security Council, made up of sort of the intelligentsia of the political science world. We are also going to spearhead an attempt to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Association organization, which its primary function is to stop Soviet aggression, to stop Soviet expansion. And we are going to render very, very significant economic support to any countries that are basically our allies and are opposed to communism. We are also going to create the CIA. We're going to turn the military intelligence gathering organization, the OSS, into a civilian organization, the Central Intelligence Organization, or Central Intelligence Agency. See, the problem is, military intelligence, if a spy is captured in another country and he's a soldier, then that could be construed as an act of war. But if a private citizen is visiting your country, playing a tennis match, or as a photographer or a newspaper reporter, and he gets caught smuggling secrets out of the country, he's just a citizen who the government can have what they would refer to as plausible deniability. So it's not necessarily an act of war, as it would be if it were a military person. Okay, so the arms build up. We are going to build more atomic bombs. More atomic bombs. But then we also developed the hydrogen bomb. We developed the H-bomb, which is far more powerful, far more powerful. And then on the 29th of August, 1949, this beautiful mushroom cloud goes up into the air. There's a problem with this cloud, though. There's one problem with this cloud. That's not our mushroom cloud. It doesn't belong to us. This isn't ours. So whose is it? It's the Soviet Union. The Russians have ignited their first atomic bomb, which basically gives us the information that the Russians have had spies working in our agencies the entire time. Part of what the whole Cold War is about espionage. The fact that we've got spies all over the place. Now, the second thing, the NSC. This is George Kennan. Most of you guys have been reading about George Kennan in his essay that he wrote about the Cold War. In the White House, the NSC will help the president direct his foreign policy. They're kind of like a think tank. These are the professionals. If any of you have ever seen Cold War movies like North by Northwest or any of the other Cold War movies, there's always one man that everybody looks to for guidance. He's usually wearing a tweed coat and he's got patches on his sleeves, and sometimes they even call him Professor. Well, Professor. Well, Professor. This is the Cold War expert. This is the intelligentsia. This is the one who's supposed to lead us in our response against communism. Okay? So this group will be the ones who determine our policies, how we do things. And what they do is essentially they sit in a closed room and they speculate about situations. I don't know if any of you have seen this old movie with Matthew Broderick called War Games. In the film, they create a computer that will simulate a thermonuclear war. And depending on how the launches take place and how it happens, who launches first, who launches second, what are the targets hit, restricted targets, open targets, the computer is supposed to estimate who would win the thermonuclear war. And that's the kind of thing they sit around and do. They speculate about what our response would be if this happens, what our response would be if this happens. And that's basically how we're going to guide our foreign policy. Okay? The NSC is going to be headed by Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson is going to become the Secretary of State under Truman. He will replace Marshall, General Marshall. Marshall, however, isn't going to be put into mothballs. Marshall is going to be sent to Europe to orchestrate rebuilding of Europe after World War II, because we still have that philosophy. The way to stem the tide of communist expansion is to put people's lives back in order. And so we are going to expend billions of dollars to rebuild France and Germany and England in order to keep them from turning communist. From this time of being part of World War II into this peacetime area, we are going to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Its primary focus is against the Soviet Union, which for most people in the United States seems to be odd, considering the fact that the Soviet Union was our allies during the war. During the conflict, they were on our side. And now that the Germans have been defeated, all of a sudden we see Soviet aggression. Well, the aggression comes in the scope of the fact that after the Germans are defeated, the Soviets keep moving forward. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. And they secure those areas. They secure those areas and they don't leave. So the Russians have created for themselves what they would refer to as a buffer zone between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. Eventually, this will be referred to as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact, which is sort of the Soviets' version of our NATO organization. Truman, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine is this: we will render aid to any government fighting communism. This is clearly seen in the fact that we give monies to both Turkey and Greece, as because of the end of the war, Turkey and Greece are both in threats of being, basically communist insurgencies in their two territories because of where the Soviet Union's position are. And so we give them money. The problem is Greece and Turkey have historically hated each other and are constantly in conflict. And so most of the money we give to them to fight communism actually winds up using to fight each other. Marshall is going to be given $12 billion to help rebuild Europe. Germany has been pummeled to death. Marshall is going to use much of that money to help rebuild the German infrastructure and start bringing Germany back to a point to where it can also become productive again. Okay. Now, next prong, the CIA. The CIA was called the Office of Strategic Services. Okay. It was military intelligence during the war. It conducted covert activities behind enemy lines and things like that. There was even an OSS agent in the Pacific named OSS Agent Number 19. Here's his picture. Here's his picture. His name is Uncle Ho. Uncle Ho. I guess in the 1920s, he was known as Nguyen Quan Quoc. Nguyen Quan Quoc. That means Nguyen who hates the French. But basically during World War II, Ho Chi Minh, as we know him now, assists American pilots who get shot down over China, over occupied territory by the Japanese, and he helps those pilots get back to their units so they can get back on planes and fight in the war effort against the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh was our asset. He was our support. And as a matter of fact, at the end of the war, when the Japanese are in charge of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh believed that the Americans would sponsor and support his leading of the country, which would no longer be a colonial power, which unfortunately for him, he was misguided. This new civilian organization, this Central Intelligence Agency, is going to conduct covert actions, basically what we're going to call behind the Iron Curtain. Their purpose is to collect and analyze data. And the way to do that is to create and train assets. So I couldn't sneak into a Chinese munitions factory and collect data because I really wouldn't fit in. However, if I have a businessman who has business in China, I make contacts with Chinese individuals, and these Chinese individuals who work in the factory would go into the factory and they would gather the data and bring it out. That's what we mean by creating and training assets. These assets would work through me. They would bring me small pieces of information. Nobody brings large pieces of information because if you're caught with a small piece of information, it might be overlooked. But once I get these 10 small pieces of information, then it becomes a whole picture. Then it's useful information. And so that's what the CIA is doing at this point. Gathering, collecting, analyzing data. Okay? In an effort to fight communism. Around the world. Okay, now, let's see what time. What we're going to look at now is Truman's administration and the conflicts that he has. I think we're going to end this video here. We'll look at some of the conflicts that Truman has in both Europe, and then the conflicts he has in Asia, and then the conflicts he's going to have in the United States. And by doing that, we will see Harry Truman, his administration, and this creation of this national security state, how it applies directly, and then we'll move on to Eisenhower.